On December 17, 1903, at 10:35 in the morning, a fragile wooden and fabric machine lifted off the sand at Kill Devil Hills near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, traveled 120 feet in 12 seconds, and landed safely. Orville Wright had just made the first controlled, powered, sustained flight of a heavier-than-air machine. 3 more flights followed that day, the longest covering 852 feet in 59 seconds. The brothers telegraphed their father in Dayton, Ohio. Success 4 flights Thursday morning, all against 21-mile winds, started from level with engine power alone. They had invented the airplane. The world barely noticed. When Orville and Wilbur Wright offered their invention to the United States Army in 1905, they received a form letter rejection. The government had already wasted $50,000 on a failed aircraft and wanted nothing to do with bicycle mechanics claiming they could fly. Wilbur Wright was born on April 16, 1867, near Millville, Indiana. Orville was born 4 years later on August 19, 1871, in Dayton, Ohio, where the family had moved. Their father, Milton Wright, was a bishop in the United Brethren Church, a stern but supportive man who encouraged his son's intellectual curiosity. Their mother, Susan Catherine Kerner Wright, was mechanically gifted, building household appliances and toys for her children. Neither Wilbur nor Orville completed high school in the traditional sense. Wilbur was struck in the face during a hockey game in 1886, losing several teeth and suffering injuries that led to a period of depression. He stayed home for years, caring for his dying mother and reading voraciously from his father's library. Orville dropped out of high school before graduating to start a printing business. The brothers were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and thinking in tandem. In 1892, the Wright brothers opened a bicycle sales and repair shop in Dayton, capitalizing on the cycling craze sweeping America. By 1896, they were manufacturing their own bicycles under the Van Cleve and St. Clair brands. The bicycle business provided steady income and taught them precision mechanics, metalworking, and the importance of balance and control. It also gave them access to a machine shop where they could fabricate anything they imagined. In 1896, news reached Dayton that Otto Lilienthal, a German engineer famous for his glider experiments, had been killed in a crash. The brothers, already fascinated by flight, began reading everything they could find on aeronautics. They wrote to the Smithsonian Institution requesting information and received pamphlets on flight experiments conducted by others. Most were failures. The brothers studied the work of Lilienthal, Octave Chanute, and Samuel Langley, noting that all focused primarily on engine power and wing design, largely ignoring the problem of the control. A powered aircraft without control was useless, doomed to crash like Lilienthal's gliders. Wilbur had an insight while watching birds. They controlled their flight by twisting their wings to change the airflow. He realized that an aircraft needed 3-axis control: pitch to make the nose go up or down, roll to tilt the wings left or right, and yaw to turn the nose sideways. The brothers decided to solve the control problem first before worrying about power. In 1900, they built their first glider and traveled to Kitty Hawk, a remote barrier island on North Carolina's coast, chosen for its steady winds, soft sand, and isolation from prying eyes. The 1900 and 1901 gliders were partially successful. The brothers flew them as kites and made short glides, learning how to balance and maneuver. But the aircraft didn't perform as predicted using existing aerodynamic data from Lilienthal and others. The lift generated was far less than calculations suggested. Frustrated, the brothers returned to Dayton in late 1901, convinced that the accepted data on wing shapes and air pressure was wrong. Wilbur reportedly told Orville that man wouldn't fly for 1,000 years, but rather than give up, they decided to gather their own data. In the fall of 1901, they built a wind tunnel in the back room of their bicycle shop, a simple wooden box 6 feet long, with a fan powered by a belt drive from their shop engine. The Wright brothers spent months testing over 200 different wing shapes in their wind tunnel, carefully recording lift and drag measurements. They built miniature models from steel strips, hammering and filing them into precise shapes. They designed 2 balances from bicycle spokes, hacksaw blades, and scrap metal to measure forces with accuracy. The wind tunnel experiments gave them the most comprehensive aerodynamic data in the world, revealing that nearly all published information on wing design was inaccurate. Armed with their own data, they returned to Kitty Hawk in 1902 with a new glider that performed beautifully, making over 1,000 controlled flights. They had mastered the problem of control. Now they needed power. In 1903, the Wright brothers designed and built their own engine because no commercial engine met their needs: light, powerful, and reliable. Their mechanic, Charlie Taylor, constructed a 12-horsepower 4-cylinder engine weighing 170 pounds. More importantly, the brothers designed propellers, treating them not as simple paddles but as rotating wings. Using their wind tunnel data, they calculated the optimal shape and pitch for efficiency. Their propellers were more efficient than any existing marine or aeronautical propellers, converting over 70% of engine power into thrust. The combination of their lightweight engine, efficient propellers, and superior control system produced the 1903 Wright Flyer, a biplane with a 40-foot wingspan, twin pusher propellers, and a front-mounted elevator. It was ungainly, difficult to fly, and revolutionary. After the successful flights of December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers returned to Dayton and built an improved aircraft, the Flyer II, which they flew in 1904 at Huffman Prairie, a field east of Dayton. They made over 80 flights, gradually increasing duration and control. In 1905, they built the Flyer III, the world's first practical airplane, capable of flying for over 30 minutes, performing turns, figure eights, and controlled maneuvers. On October 5, 1905, Wilbur flew 24 miles in 39 minutes, circling the field repeatedly. The airplane was no longer an experiment. It was a working machine. The brothers stopped flying publicly, afraid that others would steal their designs before they secured patents and commercial contracts. They began offering their invention to governments. The response was indifference and rejection. In January 1905, the Wright brothers wrote to their congressman offering to sell a flying machine to the United States Army. The letter was forwarded to the Board of Ordnance and Fortification, which had funded Samuel Langley's failed aircraft experiments. Langley, the distinguished secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, had received $50,000 from the Army to build an aircraft capable of carrying a man. His aerodrome was a sophisticated design with a powerful engine, but it had no effective control system. On October 7th and December 8th, 1903, just days before the Wrights' success, Langley's aerodrome was catapulted from a houseboat on the Potomac River. Both times it plunged directly into the water, nearly drowning test pilot Charles Manley. The failures were public, humiliating, and expensive. Congress investigated, and the Army's appetite for aviation experiments evaporated. The Wright brothers' letter arrived at precisely the wrong moment. The Army, embarrassed by the Langley fiasco and facing congressional scrutiny, had no interest in more aviation schemes. On January 24, 1905, the board sent a form letter rejection. The board has found it necessary to decline to make allotments for the experimental development of devices for mechanical flight, and has informed the Wrights that, before suggestions with that object in view will be considered, it must be shown that the machine has actually been produced and will really fly. The rejection was insulting. The Wrights had already flown. They had offered to demonstrate a working aircraft, not an experimental prototype. But without seeing the flights, the board dismissed them as fantasists, no different from the dozens of crackpots who wrote claiming to have invented flying machines. The Wright brothers turned to Europe. In 1905 and 1906, they negotiated with France, Britain, and Germany, offering to demonstrate their aircraft and sell manufacturing rights. But the negotiations stalled. The brothers insisted on signing contracts before demonstrating the aircraft, protecting their patent. Potential buyers wanted to see flights before committing money. The impasse dragged on for years. Meanwhile, other inventors, using information published by aviation enthusiast Octave Chanute, were rapidly advancing. Glenn Curtiss in America, Henri Farman in France, and others were building aircraft. By 1907, skeptics openly questioned whether the Wright brothers had ever flown. The brothers had stopped flying publicly in 1905, and rumors spread that their claims were exaggerated or fabricated. The situation was absurd. The inventors of the airplane were being dismissed as frauds while imitators gained fame. In 1907, the situation began to change. Frank Lam, an American military officer stationed in Paris, saw reports of the Wrights' negotiations with the French government and wrote to President Theodore Roosevelt urging the Army to reconsider. Roosevelt pressured the War Department. On October 5, 1907, the Army Signal Corps finally contacted the Wright brothers, inviting them to submit a formal bid for a military aircraft. The specification required the aircraft to carry 2 people, fly at 40 miles per hour for at least 1 hour, and travel cross-country without landing. The Wrights agreed immediately. After years of rejection, the United States government was finally willing to listen. But the contract wasn't exclusive. The Signal Corps solicited bids from other inventors, including August Herring, who claimed to have built a superior aircraft. By 1908, the Wright brothers faced a crisis. They had contracts with both the United States Army and a French syndicate, but they hadn't flown publicly in over 2 years. Skepticism was widespread. To fulfill both contracts simultaneously, the brothers decided to split up for the first time in their lives. Wilbur would travel to France to demonstrate the aircraft for European audiences. Orville would demonstrate at Fort Myer, Virginia, near Washington, D.C., for the Army Signal Corps. Both demonstrations would use improved versions of their 1905 Flyer, capable of carrying a passenger and flying for extended periods. The brothers spent months preparing, building two identical aircraft, training, and worrying. If the demonstrations failed, their reputation would be destroyed, their contracts voided, and their years of work wasted. Wilbur arrived in France in May 1908 and assembled his aircraft near Le Mans, a city southwest of Paris. French aviators, who had been making short hops in their own aircraft, were openly skeptical. Some called the Wrights bluffers. On August 8, 1908, Wilbur made his first European flight at the Hunaudière race course near Le Mans before a crowd of about 200. He flew for 1 minute and 45 seconds, making steep banking turns and figure eights with smooth, confident control. The crowd was stunned into silence, then erupted in applause. No one in Europe had seen anything like it. French pilots flew in straight lines, barely maintaining altitude. Wilbur flew with absolute mastery, as if the aircraft were an extension of his body. Within days, tens of thousands of spectators flocked to Le Mans to witness Wilbur's flights. He flew daily, setting records for duration, altitude, and distance. On December 31, 1908, Wilbur flew for 2 hours and 20 minutes, covering 77 miles. French newspapers declared him the greatest aviator in the world. Skepticism vanished, replaced by adulation. Wilbur became an international celebrity, feted by European royalty, scientists, and politicians. The French aviation community, humbled, acknowledged that the Wright brothers were years ahead of everyone else. The brothers' insistence on control, their methodical experimentation, and their refusal to fly until the aircraft was perfected had given them an insurmountable lead. Europe's aviators had been playing with kites. The Wrights had built a machine. While Wilbur conquered Europe, Orville faced disaster in America. In September 1908, at Fort Myer, Orville made a series of successful demonstration flights for the Army Signal Corps, setting records and thrilling spectators. Over 5,000 people watched as Orville circled the parade ground, flying higher and longer than anyone in America. The Army was prepared to award the contract. On September 17th, Orville took Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, a Signal Corps observer, as a passenger for a demonstration flight. After circling several times, a propeller cracked, causing vibrations that loosened a wire. The rear rudder failed, and the aircraft plunged to the ground from 75 feet. Orville survived with severe injuries, including a broken hip and fractured ribs. Selfridge was killed instantly, becoming the first powered aircraft fatality. The crash was a devastating setback, but it didn't destroy the Wright brothers' reputation. Witnesses testified that the aircraft had been performing flawlessly until the mechanical failure. The Army postponed the trials until Orville recovered. In June 1909, Orville returned to Fort Myer with a rebuilt aircraft and completed the Army trials successfully, meeting all requirements. The Signal Corps awarded the Wright brothers a contract for $30,000, plus a $5,000 bonus for exceeding the speed requirement. The United States Army had finally purchased the aircraft it had rejected 4 years earlier. By then, the Wrights had contracts with governments and companies worldwide. Their bicycle shop had become the foundation of the aviation industry. The Wright brothers' success transformed warfare. Military leaders quickly recognized that aircraft could scout enemy positions, direct artillery fire, and cross terrain impassable to cavalry. During World War I, just 11 years after the first flight, thousands of aircraft fought in the skies over Europe. Reconnaissance aircraft observed troop movements, bombers attacked supply lines, and fighters dueled for air superiority. The war accelerated aviation development, producing faster, more powerful, and more reliable aircraft. By 1918, air power had become decisive. The tactics, strategies, and technologies developed during the war established aviation as an essential military capability. The Wright brothers' invention had changed the rules of warfare forever. The commercial aviation industry emerged rapidly. By the 1920s, airmail service connected cities across the United States. Passenger airlines followed, initially carrying daring adventurers, then business travelers, and eventually millions of ordinary people. Aviation shrank the world, making journeys that once took weeks possible in hours. The Wright brothers watched this transformation with mixed feelings. They spent years defending their patents in court, suing competitors who used their control systems without permission. The legal battles consumed time, money, and energy. Wilbur, exhausted by the stress of litigation and business pressures, contracted typhoid fever in 1912. He died on May 30, 1912, at age 45. Orville continued fighting for recognition and patent rights, increasingly bitter about imitators who claimed credit for his and Wilbur's work. After Wilbur's death, Orville largely withdrew from aviation development. He sold the Wright Company in 1915 and spent decades embroiled in a dispute with the Smithsonian Institution over the recognition of the 1903 Wright Flyer as the first successful airplane. The Smithsonian, protective of Samuel Langley's reputation, displayed the failed aerodrome with labels suggesting it was capable of flight, a claim the Wright brothers disputed. In 1928, Frustrated by the Smithsonian's refusal to acknowledge the truth, Orville lent the 1903 flyer to the Science Museum in London. It remained there until 1948, when the Smithsonian finally conceded and issued a statement recognizing the Wright brothers as the inventors of the airplane. Only then did Orville allow the flyer to return to America. Orville Wright died on January 30th, 1948, at age 76, just months after the flyer was installed at the Smithsonian. He lived long enough to see aviation transform the world. Commercial airlines spanned continents. Military aircraft had decided the outcome of World War II. Jet engines were replacing propellers. Helicopters hovered over battlefields. Aviation had become indispensable to civilization, yet Orville remained largely unknown to the public. The Wright brothers had been overshadowed by more flamboyant aviators like Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart. Their methodical, scientific approach, so effective in solving the problem of flight, made poor material for heroic legends. They were remembered as mechanics, not visionaries. The Wright brothers' legacy is measured not in fame, but in capability. They approached flight as an engineering problem, breaking it into components: lift, drag, thrust, and control. They tested hypotheses systematically, gathering data in wind tunnels, measuring results in gliders, and refining designs through iteration. They refused to fly until their aircraft was controllable, rejecting the prevailing belief that power alone would conquer the air. Their insistence on three-axis control became the foundation of all successful aircraft. Every airplane since 1903, from the simplest trainer to the most advanced fighter, uses the principles the Wright brothers established. The rejection the Wright brothers faced from the United States Army was not unique. Innovators throughout history have been dismissed by the institutions they sought to serve. Watt's radar was rejected as impractical. Mitchell's Spitfire was mocked as a racing toy. Brunel's bridges and ships were called extravagant. Harrison's chronometer was scorned by scientists. Semmelweis's hand-washing was dismissed as insulting. And the Wright brothers' airplane was ignored because the government had already wasted money on a failed project. In each case, established authorities preferred familiar failures to unfamiliar successes. The pattern reveals a deeper truth. Institutions resist innovation because innovation exposes their mistakes. The Wright brothers succeeded because they ignored the experts. When published aerodynamic data proved inaccurate, they conducted their own experiments. When universities and scientists dismissed heavier-than-air flight as impossible, they built a wind tunnel and a bicycle shop and gathered better data than anyone in the world. When the Army rejected their aircraft, they went to Europe and proved its value. They didn't need validation from authorities. They needed results. Their methodical approach, testing every assumption, measuring every variable, and building only after understanding, gave them an insurmountable advantage over competitors who relied on intuition and guesswork. The Wright brothers' wind tunnel experiments remain a model of scientific investigation. With limited resources, they designed instruments precise enough to measure tiny forces, collected data systematically, and analyzed results rigorously. They made mistakes, corrected them, and learned from every failure. Their notebooks, filled with measurements and calculations, documented a process of discovery that transformed aviation from speculation into science. Modern aerospace engineering, with its wind tunnels, computational fluid dynamics, and controlled testing, traces its lineage directly to the Wright brothers' backroom experiments. They established that flight was not an art, but a discipline, governed by measurable forces and predictable behaviors. The world's initial indifference to the Wright brothers' achievement seems incomprehensible now, but it was rooted in context. Flight had been the domain of charlatans and dreamers for centuries. Dozens of inventors had claimed success, only to fail publicly. The Langley Aerodrome's spectacular crashes just weeks before the Wrights' success reinforced the belief that flight was impossible. When the Wright brothers announced their achievement in 1903, newspapers dismissed it as another hoax. The few publications that reported the flight buried it on back pages. The scientific establishment ignored it. Without photographic evidence widely distributed, and with the brothers refusing to fly publicly while negotiating contracts, skepticism persisted. The world didn't believe the Wright brothers until Wilbur flew at Le Mans in 1908. 5 years after the first flight. By the time recognition came, the Wright brothers had competitors. Glenn Curtiss, Henri Farman, Louis Blériot, and others were building aircraft using Wright principles, often without permission or payment. The Wright brothers spent their remaining years fighting patent battles, trying to protect their inventions from theft. Wilbur's death in 1912 deprived Orville of his closest collaborator and confidant. Orville continued working alone, but he never regained the creative energy that had driven the brothers' early experiments. The joy of discovery was replaced by the burden of litigation. The bicycle mechanics who had solved the problem of flight became businessmen, defending their intellectual property. The government that rejected the Wright brothers in 1905 eventually recognized its mistake, but the damage was done. By the time the Army purchased a Wright aircraft in 1909, European governments had already ordered dozens of planes. French and British manufacturers were producing aircraft based on Wright designs, sometimes legally licensed, often pirated. America, home of the airplane's inventors, lagged behind Europe in aviation development until World War I forced massive investment. The Army's initial rejection cost the United States years of leadership in a technology that would define 20th century warfare. Bureaucratic caution had prevailed over visionary innovation. The Wright brothers' story illustrates the cost of institutional skepticism. The Army had been burned by Langley's failure and refused to risk further embarrassment. The scientific establishment, dominated by academics, dismissed self-taught mechanics as unqualified. European governments, more desperate for military advantage, were willing to take risks. The result was that the United States, despite inventing the airplane, surrendered leadership to foreign competitors. The pattern has repeated throughout history. America innovates, then hesitates, allowing others to capitalize. The Wright brothers' rejection by their own government stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of risk aversion. The Wright brothers never sought fame or glory. They wanted to solve a problem that had fascinated them since childhood: how to fly. They approached it methodically, patiently, and collaboratively. They shared credit equally, signing letters and patents as the Wright brothers, never distinguishing individual contributions. When asked who had accomplished more, they deflected, insisting that neither could have succeeded without the other. Their partnership, rooted in mutual respect and complementary skills, was as important to their success as their technical innovations. Wilbur was the theorist, the writer, the public face. Orville was the engineer, the builder, the perfectionist. Together, they changed the world. The Army that rejected them learned its lesson too late. By 1918, the United States was producing thousands of aircraft for World War I, but most were based on European designs. The Wright brothers' patents had expired or been licensed widely. Their monopoly, so fiercely defended, had dissolved. The aviation industry they had created moved on without them. Yet every aircraft that flew, every pilot that trained, every tactic developed, owed its existence to the methodical experimentation of two bicycle mechanics from Dayton. They had proven that powered, controlled flight was possible. Everything else followed from that proof. The government dismissed their machine, but the machine changed the rules of warfare anyway.